me, this is an ongoing an ongoing process of discovery, sometimes serendipitous and sometimes uncomfortable. And now I'm going to share my slides with you. Here we go. Can you see my, just start with.
Yeah, we can see it, Michelle.
Okay, great. Okay. So one of the things that I find I need to do when I'm getting anxious about writing is going back to how I ended up here. So I ask you to think about how you ended up here at 9 in the morning in this little Zoom world. For me, it started with growing up in a housing co-op. And yes, one of those children is me, the one missing teeth. And in that housing co-op in Edmonton, I had multiple neighbors that fed me, encouraged me to occasionally attend school so I didn't get in more trouble. And from a young age, I attended a lot of workshops about human rights and nuclear war, which I wouldn't necessarily suggest bringing 6-year-olds to, but I did learn a lot. And this impacted me in how I became a scholar and a writer, and what community means in terms of who's included and excluded. So recently I started writing, but also filming a documentary about Kigano, because it was a co-op that was developed in the 70s, mixed income, and quite one of the first of its kind in Western Canada. And so I thought I'd write about the trials and tribulations of a mixed income community. And, you know, as with anything, when you start to do the research, unexpected things emerge. And so I found out Kigano is actually on the stolen land of the Papas First Nation that were forced from their land in around 1881. And so those who created Kigano didn't know this, but the question became, how did they not know this? I did my BA in anthropology and focused on the Lubicon Cree Nation and government and corporate collusion and the impacts on the Lubicon. So it really got me thinking about how I didn't know this. Writing for me has always been a way to try and understand how I didn't know something before, or what we know and what we don't know. And that's, and really to try and figure out, you know, what is said versus what I would see occurring. It also, you know, how I became an academic is also what I attempted and didn't do so well. So in high school, for example, I decided to work in the restaurant industry and not go to school for some time. And I thought I could just educate my customers about social justice issues. But, you know, after an elastic ended up in a break from my braces ended up in somebody's salad, and I had a few words with customers I found to be somewhat objectionable, my boss said to me, you know, you might want to reconsider school, honey. The restaurant industry is not, or any industry service is not going to be one for you. So I went back to school, and again, went to university, started to learn a lot about, not enough, about Indigenous people in Canada, and started to have to really challenge some of the myths that I had grown up with around Canada as this country of multiculturalism and of acceptance, and a country that did no harm. So academic writing has always been a way for me to figure that out, in a sense. And so I've never been able to actually separate what's happening to me, or what I'm seeing in life or in practice, and what I write about and how I write about it. So for me, my first master's I did after I had been the national youth president for the NDP. And I was trying to figure out all the commitments around social justice and gender and youth, and the reality of what I was seeing, which was predominantly white male leadership, and quite often seeing women being dismissed and racialized groups being dismissed. So trying to figure out the stated commitments versus the reality of what I was seeing. And again, not just what I was seeing in terms of what other people are doing, but also in terms of what I was doing. Why was I conforming sometimes to things that I really didn't believe in, and actually wrote about in opposition, yet when I was in those structures, found myself conforming. Similarly, I did a second master's looking, you know, after I'd been teaching in adult education and working mainly with refugees, and seeing teachers hearing teachers in the staff room talking about their students based on media reports. And so at the time, there was a lot of negative media about the Somali community, and talking about this and almost the media trumping, now the word trumping has a whole new meaning, but trumping their actual experience, often very positive experiences with students. And so that was something that I really became curious about, is how, again, is commitments around equity, commitments around inclusion, how does that end up getting, how does that change, or is it implemented or not, in terms of what happens in structures of, for example, educational institutions. So, you know, the beliefs and the values of what we say versus what is done, and not just looking at that from a perspective of the individual as being good or bad, but how an individual operates in different structures and why. And so, okay, I have a picture of an airplane there. I meant to take that out. At one point, I thought I'd become a pilot too, because I thought learning to fly would be a good way to get better with north, south, and east, west. Directions, actually, when people use those words, I find them highly offensive because I don't understand any of them. So I did try flying, flew on my own. But again, my flying instructor said, you know, yeah, this might not be for you. So PhD, again, was looking at, I was looking at an eating disorder clinic that had a really charismatic leader that became famous through 2020 and Oprah. It was a fraud. And again, I was interested in how it is that we come to believe things that don't really make any sense through media. And including, and what I was interested here is how people that are highly schooled also come to believe. So I guess I was trying to, here again, it was going back and forth. At the time I did my PhD, I was working at an office that investigated child deaths and children in care. And so I was trying to figure out, like, how did I come to believe what I believe about children? How do other people come to believe? And what does that mean for those children's lives, their families, and how we see ourselves as a society versus how children are treated in society? So this is the interesting part. Well, I found it interesting, is I had done at this point, you know, a bachelor's, 2 masters, gone in all sorts of different ways, was starting to work on my PhD. And one of my professors, Richard Townsend, said to me, you know, everything you do is connected somehow to media. You're fascinated by how people come to believe through media and how people can try and counterframe through media. Now, what is kind of stunning is I had not figured this out myself. He needed to tell me this, and it was like a major revelation for me, which is kind of stunning when I think about it. But it was really important, and it actually helped me decrease my anxiety to figure out, okay, what do I care about? And all these things that might seem off on different tangents, okay, the flying thing was, are actually connected. And so how do I connect those things in terms of what I'm committed to and why I write? Just gonna look at my notes here. So I'm just gonna go here. So there's learning, this is something I often come back to, figuring out who I write for and why. My reasons might be different than that of other academics, and that's okay. There is a need for scholars and scholar practitioners that see their role in different ways. For some, they see the good scholar as one who publishes frequently in top-ranked journals, peer-reviewed journals, and see activism as antithetical to being a good scholar. For others, writing is part of a cycle of engaging and being challenged by academics, but as importantly, people not in academia. I'm in the latter group. Knowing where you position yourself and the consequences of doing so, I find helps with anxiety. One of the anxiety of academics is somewhat ironically can be the pressure to conform. And so this was the thing that I actually found quite surprising about having, because I spent time in government, I spent time in NGOs, is that actually sometimes there's more pressure to conform in academia. But what I love about the working with EDD students is that actually you have, in a sense, have been in different worlds and don't necessarily respond to that pressure in the same way. So to realize that one can be a scholar and one can be a practitioner. But what I think is important, though, is to know when you're not conforming to something, why. So I'm not for never conforming. There's some things about academic writing that I think are actually very important to conform to. But what's been helpful to me, and what was helpful to that professor way back in my PhD, was figuring out, okay, here are what the rules are. If you're going to break them, know what they are and be able to articulate that. And so I think that for me, what was important is to say, okay, for me, writing is a part of a cycle. So writing is, I want to engage with academics, but just as important for me is to engage with non-academics and to be challenged by those non-academics. And so figuring out and reflecting. I mean, sometimes I as a grad student, I would just be, I don't want to do this. So having to figure out, am I not conforming or accepting something because I just don't want to do it, or because it's uncomfortable, or because I actually see it as antithetical to who I am as a person and why I'm an academic. So there's the standard suggestions. The suggestions I've been given, for example, stop at 5 cups of coffee a day. As a doctoral student, I was more like 9 cups. But then I ended up having, heart palpitations. And the doctor was like, well, yes, that's, if we use a bit of logic and you cut back on your coffee, that might help. Timed writing, this is something that's really helped to me a lot. So I joined an online writing group and then set up one for my students because it was so helpful to me. So what we would do is write for a set period of time, usually 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then take a 5-minute break, even if we didn't want to. And at first, this seemed absurd to me. It's like, I have limited time. You want me to take a 5-minute break every half hour? That's ridiculous. But actually, I got way more done. And what was interesting about it was, especially when I was really anxious, was telling myself I have to write all day. Was kind of the kiss of death, right? Because if it was a bad day or if other things came up, then, I'd feel like a complete and utter failure. So saying to myself, I'm just going to write for 25 minutes a day. And if I can write more, that's great. Is one way that I find can be really helpful. And I think it's been helpful to some of the students I've worked with as well. So that might be one thing to think about. The exercise thing, for me, it's kind of essential. So then we get to why write at this point. The world's in a mess and I'm writing something nobody is going to read. So in the last year, I get, I'm sure many do, like a lot of requests to speak, to talk about the various crises that we're dealing with as a planet. And the big thing for me is not seeing this as an either or. So I still do that work, and it's really important in terms of how it informs my writing, but I need the writing to slow down and to reflect at a time where everything seems to be going so quickly. Well, I mean, slowly and quickly at the same time with the virus. So, so we have the pandemic, we have climate crisis, we're hearing about human rights abuses every day. And so when we're bombarded with one crisis after another, it can be difficult to say, oh, I need to write my dissertation, or I need to get that paper in, which is very late, that I need to get into the publisher. And so I guess here, I mean, this is one that I'm not going to sugarcoat for myself, because I do find it hard to focus on that. And then I think about my time in government and interviewing journalists who, I didn't find one that read academic articles as part of creating policy or framing their articles. So it can be, it can lead to, at least in my case, occasional, sometimes more than occasional existential crises. So what does one do when you're in this situation? And for many of you that have children, that have people to take care of, that it can almost seem selfish. It's like, why on earth am I spending time writing this when I've got a kid that needs me, a parent that needs me? And so I think that for many, this is a really difficult time to write, but I would say perhaps it's one of the most essential times to be writing. So becoming an academic. So I think becoming a scholar practitioner is an opportunity to slow down. For me, it's always been an opportunity to think about my practice, to reflect on it, and think about how I want to be different in the world. It's also, though, a time to sort of think about how do I engage with others and engage with a genre that may be very new and not be crushed by that. And then we get to feedback. And feedback is a tough one, right? When it's critical feedback, especially when one is feeling anxious and tired and you've worked on that draft that you think is, I'm done, I am defending, but your professor has some different ideas. So I thought I would go over just some of the feedback and responses. Some of this is responses I have had to feedback, and some of it has been responses that others have had to my feedback or others. So feedback on writing. Professor, this is a solid first draft. I'd like you to consider X, Y, and Z. Or chapter 1 to 3 need substantial revisions. What is heard? My professor thinks I am a failure, an unmitigated failure. Or, great, well done. Let's get on to setting a defense date. Or I was hoping to just reconsider X, but better to know now rather than at defense. Oh, sorry. I'd like you to rewrite the methodology section, or your methodology section needs work. Students' reaction, is this ever going to end? Or, okay, I deleted everything and I'm starting over. Or, I could just revise my methodology section. Professor, your citation of X is not accurate. Please reread X's work and rewrite this section of your literature review. Student, my life is over. Or, well, each to their own interpretation. Or, I best go reread the piece. Can you say more about your positionality? This is my story and I'm not changing it. Oh, and sadly, I can now not get to. Or, I agree, my story isn't very interesting. I've deleted it. Or maybe now is not the time. I don't have the supervisor for what I want to learn. I need to explain more clearly what I hope to be achieving. You might want to get some help from the Writing Resource Center. Excuse me, I write policy briefs and curriculum. Or, I'm an unmitigated failure. I promise I'll withdraw from the program today. Or, academic writing is its own thing. Or, I'm disrupting the status quo and I need to explain. So these are some, and I'll be interested to know, actually, by a show of hands, does anybody relate to any of these? Tony does. That's it? Nobody else? Oh, a few other hands. Okay. All right. Oh, good. Quite a few hands. All right. It's very weird talking to Zoom. I'm going to just try and go back to, here we are. Okay, so feedback can be tough, and feedback during this time, I think, is particularly tough because so much is lost often in written feedback or on Zoom. And this is one thing I often find about written feedback and that I had to be taught was going to school in K to 12, I mean, especially in elementary, did not do well at all. And a bunch of red pen feedback meant you have failed. Whereas as a grad student, when I'm giving a lot of feedback, it's because I respect your work and I want to engage with you as a colleague, as an emerging scholar, practitioner, or a scholar. So however you identify yourself. And so I think this is a really tough one. It's a tough one that a lot of feedback is actually a sign of respect, not a sign of you screwed up. But for many of us, and I think particularly for people that school was not a pleasant experience, a lot of those memories of being told you failed can come back with a vengeance when you're in grad school, even if school was 20, 30 years ago for you. So something to think about in terms of how we react and how often that reaction can be from long ago. But figuring out what drives you can take time, and it can lead to pesky anxiety. And so this too is where we get to thinking about when we're talking about our own practice. So one thing I find is it's often a lot easier to talk about what other institutions do wrong, but it's a whole lot harder to talk about institutions that one is implicated in. So for me, a lot of my research is about university rankings, right? And that means I'm looking a lot at my own institution. I work at a top-ranked institution, and I critique a top-ranked institution. And so thinking about this in terms of what comes up when we're looking at our own practice, and not going into a place of paralyzing guilt, but in looking at it and looking at the consequences of that. And so I think that can be a place too where I find it helpful to just say, I'm just going to let myself write. And it doesn't mean I'm going to publish. It doesn't even mean I'm going to share it, but I'm going to get it out there and write it. And that's where also I've been able to see connections. So for me, and again, a little bit embarrassing how long this took me to figure out, my fascination, some might say obsession with rankings. I didn't realize until really recently, it's not just about university rankings. It's looking at why do we rank people as good, as smart and dumb, as productive and unproductive? How does that connect to eugenics? The person that created one of the first rankings actually was a well-known eugenicist, but how does it connect to how we look at disability, how we look at ability? How does it connect to how we look at race and white supremacy? And so again, this was one thing that it actually took me quite a while to figure out why I'm so interested in rankings and how that actually connects to all the research I've done in the past, whether it's on disability, on white supremacy, and on the role of media and the stories we tell ourselves and about the societies we live in and the institutions we work in. But of course, it does lead to this sort of pesky anxiety when you're talking about your own institution, or can, for those that it doesn't, celebrate that. But it can lead to, how do I think about my institution and how I'm implicated in a way that's not immobilizing. To me, I think a way of doing that is actually writing and not saying, oh, I can't write about that. And sometimes it can be writing in different forms. In my case, it has sometimes been doing stand-up comedy about my institution. Well, not about UBC directly, but it might be informed by my experience there. But it can be writing commentary pieces and academic pieces. And so here's where I think it's really helpful to sort of think about when you're writing your dissertation is it's one form of writing, and I think a really helpful form of writing. And with that, you may then say, after you finish your dissertation, maybe I want to do a commentary piece. Maybe I want to do a podcast. Maybe there's ways that I want to talk to different publics about this work and think about how I want to use this work in different ways. And you don't have to know that all at once. I certainly have not. I've been working on rankings for years and really just recently started seeing how it connects. And this is what was interesting, was for me realizing how much it connects to growing up in a co-op. And so growing up in a co-op where the ethos was one of cooperation, there was a lot of tension around that and conflict. And I'm in a university where it's much more individualistic, right? Where it's how much have you published, how much have you been, rather than how do you work together to create knowledge, to share knowledge, to be critiqued, etc. So that was really helpful in my writing, but also in figuring out, okay, what are the tensions and contradictions I feel as somebody working at a top-ranked university? What are the tensions I feel when I'm writing about this? What are the fears that I have in writing about my own institution or my own sector? And how can I think through those in ways that don't immobilize me with anxiety? Okay. Oh, I should probably end soon. So similarly, and another thing that I find really interesting is looking at the sort of unspeakable or the erasures. So disability rights is something I'm really interested in. A colleague of mine that we've known each other since high school, and she's actually probably why I got through high school. So she's a disability rights scholar. And recently looking, for example, at the medical assistance in dying legislation that every disability rights group in Canada was opposed to, and how little voice that they were very effective in their strategy in many ways, yet they were, well, when I say effective, they were largely ignored by media, despite having very good press releases, despite having a strategy that would be seen as robust, but they were ignored. And so in looking at this, I think about, 30 years ago, how LGBTQ groups were completely ignored, or are largely ignored, or how Indigenous groups, and that it wasn't a matter of they didn't have an effective media strategy, but were largely ignored. So a lot of my writing is thinking about erasure and how we erase people and why. And connected to that is thinking about solidarities in the plural. So how we think about who is erased and who not. And that part of that for me is looking at who I collaborate with in my writing and also who I cite. And so in thinking about how do I think about myself as a public scholar, and connect that to practices. And again, I get this wrong a lot, so I want to be really clear on this, is what do I aspire to be and how does this influence my writing? So for me, that is taking risks to look at my own practice and my own institution, engaging academics and non-academics, collaborating, citing, and I think this is really important, is who do we cite? Who do we collaborate with? And from that, what kind of knowledge do we produce? Vulnerability to say I was wrong. And I guess a big part of this for me is to slow down and to remember we're interdependent. So there's so much pressure right now to go fast, fast, fast. This book I quite like, The Slow Professor, is to think about how do we slow down and think. And a big part of that for me is to remember we're interdependent. And this is where it comes to whether it's online writing groups, but collaborating with people and just supporting each other, right? So to make a decision, and again, I can only speak about my own, but to decrease my anxiety was to make a very deliberate decision that I wanted to work with others and to cite others in different ways, and that might mean that I'm not seen as highly productive, and being okay with that. So figuring out what I see as productive, what I see as a productive academic or a scholar practitioner, being able to articulate that to myself, being able to articulate that in writing, and at this particular time, I find that more important than ever, is to be able to say, we're in the middle of a pandemic and a number of crises. How do I see myself as an academic, as a public scholar? What do I aspire to be? And how do I do that with my writing? It is so weird speaking to people when nobody is here. Okay. So then there is the issue of, as I was once told, just stop reflecting and get the damn thing done. And that is, there is no such thing as a perfect dissertation. There will always be things, I hope, when you go back and look at your work and say, gee, I wish I had cited so-and-so, or I wish I had known this, or, I would do this differently. I hope that happens. I mean, when somebody says to me, I look at my work from 10 years ago and I have no thoughts about it other than it was amazing, great, I guess. But, for the most part, as learning beings, we hopefully look at our work from years ago and say, yeah, it was good for where I was at. And here's some things I might do differently, and do those things differently. Hopefully you go back at what you've written and think about how you might change it. So I think I've kind of gone through most of what I wanted to go through. I guess I Well, okay, so Deirdre can tell you why these pictures are here, perhaps. One of my other attempts at a profession was to be a primatologist. So the first master's was either in Canadian studies or primatology. I almost went for doctoral education in primatology, and it actually is immensely helpful. So primates are quite helpful in terms of looking at human behavior. And when I'm confused, often I think back to studying macaques and alphas and et cetera. So again, humor, thinking, it can be, I think, a helpful way to look at anxiety and to kind of figure out WTF. Why are you here? Why do you write? And that's it. Any questions?
Thanks so much, Michelle. That was wonderful.
You're welcome.
I like how you fit the primates in there.
I have to fit the primates in. I have to. If anybody could help me figure out how to get funding so I can go study orangutans in Borneo that connects with what I just told you my research is about, that would be awesome. I'd love